There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people believe they understand. They think it was misunderstood at the time, that the public was confused, that soldiers came home to a country that didn't know what to make of them or the conflict they'd returned from. That version is easier to hold. It places the failure somewhere in the space between perception and reality, in the fog of war, in the cultural distance between a rice paddy in Quang Tri Province and a living room in Ohio. But that framing is wrong in a specific and important way. The Vietnam War was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, and the people doing the misrepresenting knew exactly what they were doing, and they continued doing it long after the misrepresentation had become impossible to hide. This is not a story about tragedy born from confusion. It is a story about institutions that chose measurement over truth, about commanders who chose promotion over accuracy, about a government that chose appearance over reality, and about the slow, grinding process by which that series of choices turned a military campaign into something that had no name and no clear definition and no end. The men who fought in the Mekong Delta, the men who patrolled the waterways and the flooded rice paddies and the mangrove swamps of the southernmost provinces of Vietnam, did not fight in a fog. They fought in a very precise and specific kind of darkness, one that had been manufactured above them and handed down through layers of command until it settled over everything like silt settling to the bottom of a river. The Mekong Delta in 1967 was a place of extraordinary physical complexity. The river system that gave the region its name was not a single waterway but a web of tributaries and canals and flooded lowlands that spread across roughly 67,000 square kilometers of southern Vietnam, flowing through provinces with names that American soldiers learned to pronounce wrong and never bothered to correct. Ben Tre, Kien Hoa, and Nguyen, Vinh Long. The land itself was barely land. Much of it was water that had decided, provisionally and on a seasonal schedule, to tolerate the weight of something solid. The dry season revealed paddy fields and embankments. The wet season turned entire districts into shallow lakes, through which a man could wade for days without finding anything that could be called solid ground. The soldiers and sailors assigned to the Mobile Riverine Force in the Delta did not move across this landscape on foot the way their counterparts in the Central Highlands moved. They moved on water. They lived on Navy ships called APBs, Auxiliary Personnel Barracks. Floating barracks anchored in the middle of rivers wide enough to make them difficult targets and narrow enough to feel like confinement. They ate aboard those ships. They slept aboard those ships. They received orders aboard those ships, and then they climbed down into flat-bottomed assault craft called ATCs, armored troop carriers, and they moved into the Delta's waterways looking for an enemy who had been moving through those same waterways for 20 years and knew every channel and every blind bend and every patch of reeds that could conceal a man with an RPG. The enemy they were looking for had a formal military designation. The forces operating in the Mekong Delta were primarily units of the National Liberation Front, referred to by American forces and American press as the Viet Cong, a name that was partly a contraction and partly a slur, and entirely an oversimplification of a political and military organization that had roots going back to the anti-French resistance of the 1940s. The main force battalions of the Delta operated differently from guerrilla units. They were organized, trained, supplied through a logistics network that stretched from North Vietnam, down through Cambodia, and into the Delta's provinces. They knew the terrain because many of them had grown up in it. They knew the villages because many of them had family in those villages. They had been fighting, in one form or another, against one foreign power or another, for longer than most American soldiers had been alive. American military planners understood this in theory. The official doctrine that governed operations in the Delta acknowledged the importance of pacification, of winning the loyalty of the civilian population, of separating the guerrilla from the sea of people in which, as Mao had written and American strategists had read, he swam. But doctrine and reality maintained only a theoretical relationship in the Mekong Delta in 1967. The reality was a set of pressures that had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with the specific institutional culture of the United States Army in Vietnam, a culture shaped by one metric above all others, a metric that was simultaneously undeniable in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences: body count. The measurement of military success in Vietnam through the counting of enemy dead was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate policy choice, one that made a certain kind of bureaucratic sense in the context of the war as it had been defined by the men running it. The idea was rooted in the concept of attrition, the theory that if American forces could kill enemy combatants faster than they could be replaced, the enemy's capacity to fight would eventually collapse. The theory had a mathematical elegance to it. Kill enough people, and the war ends. Find the crossover point where deaths exceed replacements and the outcome becomes inevitable. The problem was that attrition strategy required accurate counting to function, and accurate counting in Vietnam was impossible for reasons that were both practical and institutional. The practical reasons were obvious to anyone who spent time in the Delta. Combat in the waterways and rice paddies of the Mekong was not the kind of combat that produced neat, countable results. Firefights happened in dense vegetation, in water, in darkness, across channels that bodies could be carried through before anyone had a chance to count them. When an American unit called in artillery or air support on a tree line and the firing stopped and they moved through the area afterward, they might find bodies, or they might find blood trails, or they might find nothing at all. In each of those cases, official doctrine required them to estimate enemy dead. The estimate was reported up the chain. At each level of the chain, the estimate was subject to the same institutional pressure that governed everything else in the war. The pressure to produce numbers that showed progress, that demonstrated success, that justified the resources being spent and the lives being lost. The institutional reasons were less obvious but more corrosive. By 1967, the system of reporting in Vietnam had evolved into something that was understood at every level to be partially fictional, and that functioned anyway because the fiction served too many interests to be abandoned. A platoon leader who reported that his unit had made contact with an enemy force and suffered 2 dead and 3 wounded, but had achieved no confirmed enemy kills, would be questioned by his company commander. A company commander who reported consistent low enemy body counts would be questioned by his battalion commander. A battalion commander who failed to produce numbers that demonstrated his unit was performing at an acceptable level risked his career, his effectiveness reports, his future promotions. The pressure did not need to be explicit. It did not require anyone to issue an order saying report false numbers. The pressure was structural, embedded in the way success was defined and the way careers were advanced, and it produced, reliably and consistently, numbers that bore an increasingly distant relationship to observable reality. The gap was not small. Investigations conducted after the war, memoirs written by officers who had served at various levels of command, testimony collected by the Senate Armed Services Committee, all of these pointed toward a consistent pattern. Enemy body counts were routinely inflated. The inflation was not random. It followed a predictable logic, doubling estimates when contact had been inconclusive, adding to counts when bodies couldn't be recovered, counting civilian dead as enemy dead when the distinction couldn't be proven or when proving it would complicate the numbers. At the level of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, the headquarters in Saigon, these inflated numbers from thousands of individual actions were compiled into weekly and monthly statistics that were then transmitted to the Pentagon and to the White House and to the public in the form of briefings that conveyed, with the authority of official military data, a picture of a war being won. General William Westmoreland, who commanded MACV from 1964 to 1968, held press briefings in Saigon that became known informally as the 5 o'clock follies. The name was coined by the journalists who attended them, by men like Peter Arnett and David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who had spent enough time in the field to understand the relationship between the numbers being announced from the podium and the reality those numbers were supposed to represent. The briefings were not entirely false in the sense that the events described had usually happened. Units had moved, operations had been conducted, contact had been made, but the narrative construction imposed on those events, the framing that turned each individual action into evidence of progress toward a measurable goal, that was fiction. It was fiction produced systematically, reviewed and approved at every level of a command structure that had organized itself around producing it. In the Delta specifically, the operational command structure added layers of complexity to the already complex problem of counting and measuring. The mobile riverine force operated under a joint Army-Navy command arrangement that was unusual enough to create its own jurisdictional ambiguities. The Army brigades assigned to the force reported through Army channels. The Navy river assault squadrons reported through Navy channels. Coordination between the two was supposed to be seamless, and in practice was frequently difficult. When an operation went badly, when a convoy was ambushed and boats were hit and men were killed, and the enemy melted back into the reeds before any body count could be established, the reporting that followed passed through two separate institutional filters, each with its own priorities and its own relationship to the truth of what had happened. The villages of the Delta were not bystanders to this war. They were its primary terrain, the human geography through which the conflict moved the way the river moved through the physical landscape, not around it, but through it, altering it and being altered by it simultaneously. The Vietnamese civilians who lived in the Delta's hundreds of small communities had been living with war in one form or another since the 1940s. They had learned to read military situations the way farmers in other regions learned to read weather, with a practical attention to detail and a deep understanding that the ability to correctly interpret what was happening might determine whether they survived the next few days. They knew which villages had NLF infrastructure embedded in them. They knew which hamlets were controlled by South Vietnamese government forces during the day and by NLF cadres at night. They knew that the Americans in their armored boats on the rivers had orders and missions and intelligence briefings, and no reliable way to tell from the river which of the people standing on the bank were combatants and which were farmers. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which had been the central mechanism of rural pacification policy in the early 1960s, had already largely collapsed by 1967. The program had been designed to separate the rural population from NLF influence by relocating villages into fortified hamlets where they could be protected by South Vietnamese forces and removed from the coercive reach of NLF organizers. The program had failed for reasons that were simultaneously practical and political. Practically, the South Vietnamese government did not have enough reliable forces to garrison enough hamlets to make the program function at the scale required. Politically, the forced relocation of farmers from land their families had worked for generations, in a culture where ancestral connection to the land was not a sentiment but a religious obligation, produced not gratitude but resentment, and the resentment provided the NLF with exactly the kind of political grievance that its organizers were most skilled at exploiting. By 1967, American commanders in the Delta were operating in a rural landscape where the pacification program had created, in many areas, not protected populations, but populations that had been displaced, angered, and in many cases radicalized by the experience of being moved at gunpoint from their homes. The villages that remained were subject to a complex and constantly shifting set of pressures. South Vietnamese government officials, the province chiefs and district chiefs and village councils, held nominal authority during daylight hours. NLF political officers collected taxes, held meetings, recruited fighters, and administered a parallel system of authority after dark. American units moved through this landscape, conducting operations based on intelligence about NLF locations that was frequently outdated, frequently wrong, and frequently generated by processes that an honest person would have had difficulty calling intelligence gathering at all. The intelligence failure in Vietnam was not simply a failure to collect information. American forces collected enormous amounts of information. The signals intelligence apparatus operated by the National Security Agency intercepted communications. The photo reconnaissance aircraft flew missions that produced hundreds of thousands of images. The Phoenix program, which began operating in 1967 and expanded dramatically in 1968, was specifically designed to identify and neutralize the NLF's political infrastructure through a combination of intelligence collection, targeted capture, and in practice, a significant amount of targeted killing. The failure was not in the volume of information collected. The failure was in the interpretation of that information, in the institutional inability to accept that the information being collected consistently pointed toward conclusions that conflicted with the narrative of progress that the command structure required. An intelligence analyst working at the May CV headquarters in 1967, who reviewed the data available from all sources and produced an honest assessment of the situation in the Mekong Delta, would have concluded something like the following. The NLF's control over the rural population remained extensive. Despite 3 years of intensive American military operations, the South Vietnamese government's administrative capacity in rural areas remained weak and in many provinces was deteriorating. The NLF's military capacity in the Delta had not been significantly degraded by American operations, and the population's political loyalty was, at best, divided and, in significant portions of the Delta, hostile to the South Vietnamese government and ambivalent or supportive toward the NLF. An analyst who produced that assessment would not have found it well received. The assessment would have conflicted with the body count statistics, the Hamlet evaluation data, the progress metrics that were being reported upward through the system. It would have required the command structure to acknowledge that the strategy was failing. And the command structure was not organized to acknowledge that. The men who were actually fighting in the Delta in 1967 did not need an intelligence assessment to tell them what was happening. They knew what was happening because they were living it, on the boats and in the paddies and in the villages, in the daily accumulation of experience that no briefing and no statistical report could adequately contain. They knew that the same areas where they had conducted operations 3 months ago had been re-infiltrated by NLF forces. They knew that the intelligence they received about enemy locations was frequently wrong. They knew that the civilians they encountered were not, as official discourse described them, a grateful population being protected by American military power. They were people who had learned to be afraid of everyone with a gun and who had developed, through long experience, a sophisticated capacity to tell the people with guns what they wanted to hear. A private first class from Indiana who had arrived in the Delta in the spring of 1967 and was assigned to a rifle company operating out of a forward base in Quang Tri Province would have understood, within weeks of arriving, that the war he was in was not the war he had been prepared for. His training had emphasized doctrine and tactics and the technical operation of weapons systems. It had given him a framework for understanding military operations that implied, at least implicitly, that military operations had goals that could be achieved and progress that could be measured. What he found in the Delta was something different. He found an operational environment where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, where the village that had seemed calm yesterday might be the source of the sniper fire that killed his squad leader tomorrow, where the body count statistics being reported by his unit bore a relationship to what he had actually experienced that he could not entirely account for and had learned not to question aloud. He learned other things quickly. He learned that the rotation system, the 12-month individual tour of duty that sent each soldier home after a year in country, regardless of the operational situation his unit was in, created a kind of institutional discontinuity that worked against everything the Army's official doctrine said about unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. By the time a soldier had been in country long enough to genuinely understand the operational environment, long enough to have developed the judgment and the local knowledge and the reflexive situational awareness that kept people alive, he was approaching the end of his tour. The knowledge he had accumulated, the understanding of specific terrain and local patterns, and the particular behavior of enemy units in his area of operations, left with him when he rotated home. The men who replaced him arrived knowing nothing, and the process of learning began again, at the same cost, with the same results. He learned that the war's geography was not static. The delta's waterways changed seasonally, and the routes that were navigable in the dry season were different from the routes that were navigable during the monsoon. The NLF understood this and adjusted its logistics and its ambush positions accordingly. American planning, operating on cycles that did not always align with the seasonal rhythms of the landscape, sometimes sent units into areas through routes that the enemy had anticipated and prepared for. The result was a pattern of operations that felt, to the soldiers conducting them, less like a campaign with a strategy than like a series of contacts that produced casualties on both sides and left the underlying situation unchanged. He learned about the sound of a rocket-propelled grenade passing close enough to feel the displacement of air. He learned about the specific quality of silence that preceded an ambush, the way the birds stopped, and the insects stopped, and the water sound stopped, and there was a moment brief enough to be almost imaginary when the jungle or the riverbank held its breath. He learned about the weight of a dead man, the specific physical difficulty of moving a body that had stopped cooperating with its own movement. He learned about the administrative procedures that followed a casualty, the forms to be filled out and the personal effects to be catalogued, and the letters to be written by officers to families in places like Iowa and Georgia and New Mexico. Letters that followed a template and said things about courage and sacrifice that were true in some general sense, and that contained nothing of the specific reality of the death they were reporting. What he was learning, piece by piece and without anyone naming it for him, was the texture of institutional failure at the point where it became personal. The failure was not abstract. It expressed itself in specific operational decisions that put men in positions that were more dangerous than they needed to be, in intelligence that was wrong, in ways that got people killed, in metrics that measured the wrong things, and thereby ensured that the wrong things continued to be done. The soldiers knew this. The sergeants knew this. Many of the junior officers knew this. But the system of knowledge within which they operated had no mechanism for transmitting what they knew upward in a form that would alter the decisions being made at the levels above them. The reporting system, which was supposed to create a flow of accurate information from the field to the command, had been corrupted by the same institutional pressures that corrupted the body count statistics. After-action reports were written with an eye toward how they would be received rather than what they accurately described. Operations that had failed to achieve their stated objectives were described in language that emphasized what had been accomplished rather than what had not. Intelligence assessments that contradicted the operational narrative were quietly revised or simply not filed. The system was self-sealing. The bad information that went into the decision-making process at the top came from a reporting structure that had learned, through incentive and example, to filter out anything that would complicate the picture that needed to be maintained. There was a specific document that illustrated this dynamic with unusual clarity, though it would not become publicly known for years. The order of battle, the formal military assessment of enemy strength maintained by a MACV's intelligence directorate, was the subject of a sustained and documented manipulation throughout 1967. The CIA and independent military analysts, reviewing the same intelligence sources available to MACV, had concluded that the total strength of enemy forces in South Vietnam was significantly higher than the numbers MACV was officially reporting. The discrepancy was not minor. Analysts like Samuel Adams at the CIA estimated that the true number of enemy combatants, including not just main force units, but the self-defense forces and political cadres that formed the backbone of the NLF's rural infrastructure, might be nearly twice what MACV was acknowledging. The implications of the larger number were intolerable to the official narrative. If enemy strength had not declined despite years of intensive American operations and hundreds of thousands of reported enemy dead, then the attrition strategy was failing by its own internal logic. The crossover point, The moment at which enemy losses would exceed replacement capacity had not been reached and might not be reachable. The body count statistics that had been used to demonstrate progress were not demonstrating progress. They were demonstrating something else, something that the command structure was not prepared to acknowledge in public and apparently not prepared to acknowledge in private either. The resolution of the order of battle dispute was not analytical. It was political. MACV insisted on the lower numbers. The CIA's analysis was suppressed within the intelligence community. The official order of battle continued to show enemy strength at levels consistent with the narrative of attrition success. The larger number, the more accurate number, was not incorporated into the planning assumptions that governed operations in the Delta and elsewhere. The men in the boats on the Mekong River continued to conduct operations based on assumptions about enemy strength and capability that the best available intelligence said were wrong. The Phoenix program, which was formally established in 1967 and placed under the control of the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Structure, CORDS, was supposed to address the political dimension of the war that purely military operations could not reach. The theory was that the NLF's durability came not from its military strength, but from its political infrastructure, from the network of village-level organizers and tax collectors and recruiting officers and intelligence agents who maintained the NLF's presence in rural communities even when its military units were not physically present. Neutralize the infrastructure, the theory went, and the military units would wither. Phoenix was designed to do this through a system of identifying, capturing, or killing specific individuals in that infrastructure based on intelligence collected from the population. The program was not secret in the sense that its existence was unknown. It was secret in the sense that its operational details were not publicly discussed and its methods were not subjected to any effective oversight. The methods were brutal. They included interrogation techniques that violated the laws of war. They included targeted killings carried out by Provincial Reconnaissance Units, PRUs, which were South Vietnamese paramilitary forces, trained and often accompanied by CIA advisors. They included, inevitably, the same corruption of metrics that afflicted every other program in the war. Phoenix reported progress in terms of neutralizations, a category that included captures, ralliers who had defected from the NLF, and kills. The neutralization numbers were reported upward through the same institutional system that produced inflated body counts. They were subject to the same pressures. They were interpreted with the same optimistic frame. The problem that no metric could capture, that no body count or neutralization figure could address, was the problem of popular legitimacy. The South Vietnamese government, the Republic of Vietnam, whose survival was the ostensible reason for the American military presence, was governing by coercion and patronage in a context where its coercive capacity was frequently inadequate and its patronage was distributed along lines of political and familial connection that excluded most of the rural population from its benefits. The government's military forces, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, were the subject of American frustration and American condescension in roughly equal measure. American advisors assigned to ARVN units reported widely varying levels of effectiveness. Some units fought well, many did not. The reasons were structural. ARVN officers were promoted through a system that rewarded political loyalty to the Saigon government rather than military effectiveness. Units that avoided casualties, even at the cost of failing to conduct effective operations, tended to fare better in the South Vietnamese military's internal politics than units that aggressively engaged the enemy and took losses. American officers who worked closely with ARVN units understood this, and their understanding created a specific kind of cognitive dissonance. The official policy was to build ARVN capacity so that South Vietnamese forces could eventually take over primary responsibility for fighting the war, a policy that would be formalized under the Nixon administration as Vietnamization, but that existed as a stated goal well before 1968. Building that capacity required treating ARVN as a partner, respecting Vietnamese sovereignty, working through rather than around the South Vietnamese military structure. The reality, experienced daily by the advisors in the field, was that the ARVN units they were working with were frequently unwilling to engage the enemy aggressively, frequently unable to retain the trained personnel they received, frequently subject to the same political pressures and corruption that afflicted the civilian government. The gap between the partnership that policy required and the partnership that reality offered was something advisors learned to navigate through a combination of patience, workarounds, and the careful management of what they reported to their superiors. In the Delta, the ARVN forces whose cooperation was required for any serious pacification effort were a constant source of operational complication. Joint operations between American units and ARVN units were required by policy and resisted by practice. The communication problems were real, but not decisive. The tactical differences were significant, but bridgeable. The deeper problem was that ARVN units in the Delta were often in a state of de facto accommodation with the local NLF infrastructure, an accommodation driven by the same logic of local knowledge and survival that governed everything in the Delta. ARVN soldiers were Vietnamese. Many of them had family in the villages they were supposed to be pacifying. The idea that they would aggressively pursue an enemy who was embedded in those villages, against whom aggressive pursuit would generate civilian casualties and community hostility, was an idea that made sense on a planning map, but made very little sense to the men on the ground. American soldiers in the Delta were not insulated from this complexity. They were embedded in it. The interpreter assigned to a rifle company was frequently the most important person in the unit for actual operational function. He translated not just language, but context. He mediated not just communication, but the cultural gap between an American military unit operating on doctrine developed for European warfare and a Vietnamese civilian population whose relationship to authority, to violence, to loyalty, and to survival had been shaped by decades of experience that no American briefing had ever adequately captured. The quality of interpreters varied enormously. Some were skilled, well-motivated, and honest about what they were hearing and seeing. Others told the soldiers what they thought the soldiers wanted to hear, or what was safest to say given the political environment in which they were operating. In either case, the American soldiers were dependent on someone whose relationship to the information being communicated was not neutral and could not be made neutral. The Free Fire Zone, or Specified Strike Zone as it was formally designated, was a military tool that expressed, in its clearest form, the breakdown of the distinction between combatants and civilians that was the inevitable result of the war's logic. A Free Fire Zone was an area designated by military authority as a zone in which any person present could be considered an enemy combatant and could be engaged without prior authorization. The designation acknowledged, implicitly, that the task of distinguishing between civilians and combatants in the designated area was too difficult or too operationally inconvenient to be attempted. It solved the problem of targeting ambiguity by eliminating the category of protected civilian within a defined geographic space. In the Delta, free fire zones covered substantial portions of the landscape, particularly in areas that had been identified as NLF strongholds. The practical effect was to create large areas of the Delta's rural landscape, where any movement, any boat on a canal, any figure in a field could be fired upon without restraint. The people who lived in those areas were nominally supposed to have been warned and given the opportunity to leave. In practice, the warnings were inadequate, the evacuation mechanisms were non-existent, and the people who remained, either because they had nowhere to go or because they could not or would not leave their land, existed in a legal category that the rules of engagement had defined as acceptable targets. The documented civilian casualty rate from military operations in the Delta was, even by conservative official estimates, significant. The actual rate was unknown and perhaps unknowable. Vietnamese civilian deaths from American and South Vietnamese military operations were not counted with the same systematic attention that was devoted to American military casualties or claimed enemy kills. They were noted sometimes in after-action reports and incident investigations when they occurred in circumstances dramatic enough or politically sensitive enough to require documentation. They were not noted systematically, not tracked in a database, not compiled into statistics that could be reviewed alongside the body count numbers to provide a more complete picture of what the war was doing to the population it was supposedly being fought to protect. The soldiers who participated in actions that killed civilians processed that experience through a variety of mechanisms. Some maintained, with varying degrees of conviction, that the civilians were not civilians, that anyone remaining in a free-fire zone was by definition complicit with the enemy and therefore not entitled to protection. Some separated the individual actions from the policy that had created the conditions for them, accepting that the policy was someone else's responsibility, and their responsibility was only to follow orders within it. Some did not process the experience at all in any conventional sense. They stored it somewhere that was not accessible during the operational tempo of daily life in the Delta, and did not know yet that the storage was not permanent, and that what was stored there would eventually demand accounting. The drug problem in American units in Vietnam was not, as official discourse sometimes framed it, a breakdown of military discipline introduced by a particular generation of soldiers. It was a response to a specific operational environment. The availability of heroin and marijuana in the Delta was a function of the same regional economics that connected Vietnam to the broader Southeast Asian narcotics trade, a trade that had its own complex relationship to various intelligence services and political factions that made the problem simultaneously more complicated and less frequently discussed than it would otherwise have been. The use of narcotics by combat soldiers was a symptom, not a cause. It reflected the specific psychological conditions created by an indefinite tour in an environment of constant low-level threat, by the absence of clearly defined progress toward a clearly defined goal, by the gap between what soldiers had been told they were doing and what they experienced themselves to be doing. The fragging incidents, the killing of American officers by American enlisted men, began appearing in official records in 1969 and would reach their peak in 1971, but the conditions that produced them were already developing in the Delta in 1967 and 1968. Fragging was not random violence. It was targeted violence directed, in the majority of documented cases, at officers or NCOs who were perceived as endangering the lives of their men through incompetence, recklessness, or the prioritization of career advancement over soldier welfare. It was, in a specific and terrible sense, a rational response to an irrational situation. The men in the boats and the paddies understood, in a way that their commanders sometimes did not, that the operations being ordered were not producing results commensurate with the risks being taken, and that the primary institutional mechanism for pointing this out, the reporting system, had been so thoroughly corrupted by institutional pressure that it no longer functioned as a feedback mechanism. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 was not a surprise to everyone. It surprised the official narrative more than it surprised the people in the field. There had been intelligence indicators, intercepted communications, reconnaissance reports, prisoner interrogations, all pointing toward a major coordinated offensive. The indicators had been received, processed through the same institutional filter that processed everything else, and largely discounted. The official assessment, driven by the same pressures that had driven the order of battle dispute, was that the enemy was not capable of the kind of coordinated nationwide offensive that the intelligence was suggesting. The body count numbers said the enemy had been weakened. The neutralization figures said the infrastructure was being degraded. The Hamlet evaluation data said pacification was progressing. An offensive of the scale that Tet represented was inconsistent with the picture that had been constructed from those numbers. When the offensive came, it came across the entire country simultaneously, attacking more than 100 towns and cities, penetrating the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon, reaching every provincial capital in the Delta. The military outcome of Tet was, in the narrow tactical sense, an American and South Vietnamese success. The NLF forces that conducted the offensive suffered enormous casualties. The popular uprising that Hanoi's planners had hoped the offensive would trigger did not materialize. The NLF's main force military structure in the south was severely degraded and would not recover its 1968 strength for years. None of that was the point. The point was the gap between what the official narrative had said was happening and what Tet had demonstrated was happening. If the enemy was as weak as the body count statistics indicated, the offensive could not have happened. If pacification was progressing as the Hamlet evaluation data suggested, the NLF would not have been able to coordinate attacks in provinces across the Delta with the logistical and organizational precision that Tet required. If the South Vietnamese government enjoyed the popular support that official reports claimed, the population of the attacked cities and provinces would have responded to the offensive with active resistance, or at least with the kind of political solidarity that a government under attack could draw on. None of those things were true, and Tet made them visibly, undeniably not true in a way that the reporting system could no longer filter. The media coverage of Tet transformed the domestic political situation in the United States in ways that had consequences for every aspect of the war. But in the Delta, in the months immediately following Tet, the operational reality did not change as dramatically as the political reality had changed. Units still conducted operations. Boats still moved through the canals. Intelligence was still gathered and acted upon. Bodies were still counted. After-action reports were still written. The machinery of the war continued to operate because the machinery of war does not stop operating when the political justification for it is undermined. It stops operating when someone with the authority to stop it gives the order. And that order was not given in February 1968 or March 1968 or April 1968. What changed after Tet was the intensity of the gap between what was being reported and what was being experienced. The command structure, under pressure from Washington to demonstrate that Tet had been a tactical defeat for the enemy rather than a strategic disaster for American policy, intensified the operational tempo. The months after Tet were among the bloodiest of the entire war for American forces. Units were pushed into operations at a pace and with a frequency that accelerated the institutional problems that had already been developing. Casualty rates rose. The strain on unit cohesion increased. The mechanisms through which soldiers adapted to the cognitive dissonance of the war were pushed harder by the additional demand. The specific geography of the Delta after Tet reflected the broader pattern. The provinces that had been attacked during the offensive had sustained significant civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. The cities and towns that had been the sites of fighting, Ben Tre most famously and most tragically, had been subjected to the kind of destruction that accompanies urban combat in environments where the distinction between military targets and civilian areas has been collapsed by the nature of the fighting. The statement attributed to an American officer in the aftermath of the battle for Ben Tre that it had been necessary to destroy the town in order to save it was almost certainly not delivered in quite those words, and may have been a composite of several different things said by several different people at different times. But the statement captured something real about the operational logic that had governed the battle. The logic that said that the military objective of clearing an urban area of enemy forces had to be achieved regardless of what that achievement did to the area itself or the people living in it. The Delta's civilian population absorbed the impact of post-Tet operations in ways that were not recorded in any systematic way, and that would not be fully understood until long after the war ended, if they have been fully understood even now. The displacement of civilian populations from areas that had been contested during the offensive added to the already significant number of internally displaced people in the Delta. The destruction of agricultural land and infrastructure disrupted the seasonal rice cultivation that was the economic foundation of the region. The trauma inflicted on communities that had been sites of fighting, on people who had watched their neighbors die, who had lost family members, who had seen their homes destroyed, was a form of damage to the social fabric of the Delta that no pacification program and no reconstruction effort could simply repair. The pacification program itself underwent a significant reorganization in 1968 under the Chord structure, with Robert Comer, whose nickname Blowtorch reflected his approach to the bureaucratic politics of managing pacification programs, driving a more aggressive and systematic effort to demonstrate progress. The Hamlet evaluation system was revised and expanded. The Phoenix program was intensified. The Xiu Hoi, or Open Arms program, which offered amnesty and financial incentives to NLF defectors, was pushed more aggressively. Each of these programs had metrics. Each of those metrics was subject to the same institutional pressures that had corrupted every other set of metrics in the war. The numbers produced by the revised pacification effort showed improvement. Whether they accurately reflected improvement in the underlying political and security situation was a question that the system was not designed to answer. The soldiers in the Delta in 1968 and 1969 were different from the soldiers who had been there in 1965 and 1966 in ways that reflected the cumulative effect of the war's specific institutional failures. The men of the early years had arrived with a set of assumptions about the war, about the possibility of progress, about the meaning of their service, that had not yet been fully tested by experience. The men of the later years arrived in an environment already shaped by everything that had come before. The institutional culture they entered had been formed by years of pressure and accommodation and corruption, and it expressed itself in a set of behavioral norms that they absorbed before they fully understood what they were absorbing. The short-timer calendar, the practice of counting down the days remaining in a tour, was one expression of this. It reflected a relationship to military service that was fundamentally different from the relationship that doctrine and tradition prescribed. The soldier who was counting down his days was not thinking about the campaign's objectives or the unit's mission or the strategic situation. He was thinking about his own survival and his own rotation date. The rotation system had created a war of individuals serving individual tours rather than units building institutional knowledge and commitment over time. And the short-timer calendar was simply the visible expression of the relationship to the war that the system had produced. The anti-war sentiment in the United States, which grew through 1968 and 1969 into a major political force, had effects inside the military that were complex and not easily categorized. Some soldiers shared the anti-war politics of the movement at home. Some were hostile to it, feeling that it undermined their service and their sacrifices. Most occupied a position somewhere between those poles, holding views about the war that were more complicated than either full support or full opposition. Views shaped by specific experience rather than political ideology. What was common, more common than either enthusiastic support or principled opposition, was a kind of exhausted pragmatism. The war was what it was. The question that mattered was getting through the next patrol, the next operation, the next month, and then the next. This pragmatism was not cynicism exactly, though it sometimes looked like cynicism from the outside. It was an adaptation to an environment in which the broader purposes and justifications and narratives that were supposed to make the war legible had all failed to hold up under the pressure of experience. The soldier who had spent 8 months in the Delta had watched the intelligence briefings produce predictions that didn't pan out. He had watched the body count numbers accumulate without producing any visible change in the enemy's capacity or willingness to fight. He had watched the pacification metrics improve on paper, while the village he was assigned to protect remained as ambiguous and as dangerous as it had been when he arrived. He had developed, out of these accumulated experiences, a working theory of the war that bore very little resemblance to any official account, and that he had learned through the same institutional process that shaped everything else, not to express through official channels. The unofficial channels were where truth moved in Vietnam. It moved in letters home that said things that official documents did not say, though those letters were written with the knowledge that they might be read, and with the consequent self-censorship that knowledge produced. It moved in conversations between soldiers in the hours between operations, in the particular kind of dark humor that combat units develop as a pressure release for experiences that cannot otherwise be expressed. It moved in the journals that some soldiers kept and that some did not keep, because keeping a journal meant keeping a record, and a record meant facing, in a form that had to be written and could be reread, things that were easier to leave unwritten. The journalists who covered the Delta in the late 1960s and early 1970s occupied a specific and uncomfortable position in the war's information ecology. The best of them understood that the official narrative was false in its broad outlines and in many of its specific claims. They had access through their reporting to a reality that contradicted the briefings at the 5 o'clock follies and the congressional testimony of generals and the optimistic assessments of administration officials. They reported what they found, but what they found was often specific and individual, resistant to the kind of systemic analysis that would have required access to the classified documents and the internal command deliberations that were not available to reporters working in the field. The Pentagon Papers, the classified history of American involvement in Vietnam, commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and completed in 1969, contained the systemic analysis that the reporters in the field could not access. The study, which ran to more than 7,000 pages and covered American involvement in Vietnam from the Truman administration through 1967, documented in meticulous detail the pattern of deception and self-deception that had characterized American policy. It documented the gap between public statements and private assessments at every level of government. It showed that decision-makers had known things that conflicted with what they were saying publicly, had known them for years, had continued saying the public things anyway. The study was completed in 1969. It was classified top secret. It remained classified until Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had worked on the study and who had undergone through his experience in Vietnam and his subsequent reflection on it, a profound transformation in his understanding of what the war was and what the government's conduct of it meant, made copies of it and provided those copies to the New York Times. The Times began publishing excerpts in June 1971. The Nixon administration sought to prevent further publication through prior restraint. The Supreme Court ruled against the administration. The papers continued to be published. What the Pentagon Papers revealed was not, in its broad outlines, surprising to anyone who had been paying close attention to what the journalists in the field had been reporting for years. The specific details were new, and the documentation was devastating in its specificity. But the general shape of the story, that the government had been misleading the public and itself about the prospects for success in Vietnam, was not a revelation. What was striking was the consistency of the pattern over time. The way that each administration, each set of decision-makers, had received assessments from their own analysts that said the strategy was not working, had heard the evidence, and had chosen to continue the strategy anyway, choosing appearance over reality not once but repeatedly across administrations and across years. In the Delta, the war continued through the revelations of Tet, through the publication of the Pentagon Papers, through the withdrawal of American combat forces that began under Nixon's Vietnamization program. The character of the war in the Delta changed as American units withdrew and ARVN units took over primary responsibility for operations. But the change was not a resolution. It was a transfer, and the transfer was not clean. The ARVN forces that assumed operational responsibility in the Delta in 1971 and 1972 faced the same operational environment that American forces had faced, with the same inadequate intelligence, the same corrupted reporting systems, the same gap between official metrics and operational reality, and without the material resources and firepower that American forces had been able to call on. The ceasefire agreement signed in Paris in January 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, produced a ceasefire in name that did not produce one in the Mekong Delta. Both sides treated the ceasefire as a political deadline to be exploited rather than a military boundary to be respected. In the weeks before the ceasefire took effect, South Vietnamese and NLF forces maneuvered aggressively to improve their positions, to capture territory and establish control over villages that would determine the political map that the ceasefire would freeze. The fighting continued after the ceasefire, at lower intensity but without interruption, as both sides tested the enforcement mechanisms and found them absent. The American military advisors who remained in Vietnam after the formal withdrawal of combat forces operated in a position of institutional ambiguity. They were present. They were advising. They were, in many cases, deeply aware that the forces they were advising were struggling to maintain the positions that had been handed to them, that the military and political situation in the Delta was not improving, that the carefully managed statistics and the optimistic briefings that continued to flow through official channels did not reflect the reality on the ground. They reported what they found through channels. The channels processed the reports through the same institutional filters that had processed everything for the preceding decade. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 was the visible end of something that had been ending in pieces for years. In the Delta specifically, the final collapse came with the speed that had been made possible by the accumulated failures of the preceding decade. The military units that were supposed to defend the provincial capitals of the Delta had been undermined by the same problems that had undermined them throughout the war, by poor leadership selection, by corruption in the logistics system, by the absence of the American firepower and support that had supplemented their operational shortcomings, by the simple fact that the political commitment to continue fighting a losing war was not infinitely sustainable. The NLF and North Vietnamese forces that moved through the Delta in April 1975 moved through a landscape that had been transformed by a decade of war. The population had moved. Villages that had been inhabited before the war were empty. Forests that had been green were grey with defoliant residue. Waterways that had been clean were polluted with the runoff of military operations. The land itself bore the physical marks of the war in ways that would persist for decades, in unexploded ordnance that would continue killing people, in soil that had been rendered infertile by chemical contamination, in the absence of the trees and vegetation that had once defined the landscape and would take a generation to begin to recover. The men who had fought in the Delta returned to the United States into an environment that was not equipped to receive what they brought back. The veterans organizations that existed were oriented toward the experience of earlier wars, toward a model of service and return that assumed the war had been won and the veteran had participated in a victory. The therapeutic infrastructure for processing combat trauma was underdeveloped, based on understandings of psychological injury that were inadequate to the specific nature of what Vietnam veterans had experienced. The political environment was polarized in ways that made honest public acknowledgement of the war's actual character almost impossible. The veterans were not welcomed, as the mythology of later years would sometimes have it, with active hostility by a uniformly hostile public. Most of them came home to indifference, which was in its own way more difficult to process than hostility would have been. The Agent Orange exposure that had been part of daily life in the Delta for the soldiers who served there was not, in 1968 or 1975, a subject that the Department of Defense was prepared to acknowledge as a health problem. The herbicide had been deployed extensively throughout the Delta and elsewhere in Vietnam as part of the defoliation program, Operation Ranch Hand, whose purpose was to deny the enemy the cover of vegetation. The chemicals used, including the dioxin-contaminated compound known as Agent Orange, were known, to the extent that the scientific literature available at the time addressed the question at all, to be potentially harmful to human health. The extent of the harm, the specific diseases and conditions that would develop in veterans and in Vietnamese civilians who had been exposed, was not fully understood at the time of exposure and would not be fully acknowledged for decades. The process by which the Department of Veterans Affairs eventually acknowledged the connection between Agent Orange exposure and specific health conditions was itself a small reproduction of the larger pattern of the war. The veterans who developed cancers, the veterans whose children were born with birth defects, the veterans who experienced neurological symptoms brought their claims to a system that was resistant to acknowledging them. The official position, held for years, was that the evidence linking Agent Orange exposure to specific health outcomes was insufficient to establish a causal connection. The evidence that veterans and their advocates presented, the epidemiological studies, the biological plausibility arguments, The sheer number of similar cases from men who had served in the same areas and been exposed to the same compounds was processed through an institutional filter that had interests in the outcome and that applied a standard of proof that was, in practice, nearly impossible to meet. The pattern was familiar. The institution with the information had an interest in the outcome of the information's interpretation. The people seeking acknowledgement were outside the institution and dependent on the institution for access to the information they needed to make their case. The official position was maintained through procedural requirements and evidentiary standards that served the institutional interest. The individuals seeking recognition paid the cost of the delay in the form of untreated illness and denied benefits. The eventual acknowledgement, when it came incompletely and incrementally. Each condition added to the list of service-connected diseases only after sustained advocacy and political pressure had made continued denial more costly than acknowledgement. The Vietnamese civilians who had been exposed to Agent Orange in the Delta and elsewhere in Vietnam did not have recourse even to the inadequate systems available to American veterans. The dioxin contamination of specific areas of the Delta, including the areas around former American airfields and base areas where the compounds had been stored and handled, remained a significant public health problem for decades. The Vietnamese government documented elevated rates of cancer and birth defects in affected areas. The scientific literature supported the connection. The political and legal mechanisms for addressing the Vietnamese exposure, for obtaining acknowledgement or compensation from the American government or the manufacturers of the compounds, were essentially non-existent. The Vietnamese victims existed outside the frame of the American institutions responsible for the harm. The oral histories collected from Vietnam veterans in the decades after the war, when the political temperature had dropped enough to allow for more honest accounting, showed a consistent pattern. Men who had served in the Delta described an experience that was fundamentally different from the experience described in official records. They described the corruption of the reporting system, the pressure to produce numbers, the gap between what they observed and what they reported. They described the civilian casualties that had not been counted, the operations that had failed by any honest measure while being described as successes in the after-action reports. They described the drugs and the fragmentation and the breakdown of the structures that were supposed to provide meaning and purpose to what they were doing. They also described, and this was perhaps the most consistently observed element across the oral histories, a specific kind of moral experience that resisted easy categorization. It was not guilt in the sense that the word implies a clear understanding of having done something wrong. It was something more diffuse and more permanent. Something shaped by the specific conditions of the war, by the impossibility of being certain, in the environment of the Delta, who was the enemy and who was the civilian, by the weight of actions taken in conditions of uncertainty, whose consequences could not be known at the time and could not be fully assessed afterward. The veterans who carried this experience did not, most of them, talk about it easily or often. They carried it in a private register, present but not processed, real but not yet legible even to themselves. The historiography of the Vietnam War has been, from the beginning, a contested field in a way that reflects the unresolved political and moral questions the war raised and that the war's outcome did not resolve. The revisionist literature that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, associated with writers like Harry Summers and Louis Sawley, argued that the war had been winnable, that the military had not lost in the field but had been betrayed by political constraints and public opinion, that the failure was one of will rather than strategy. This argument had appeal in certain political contexts and has maintained a presence in public debate. It was, and remains, fundamentally inconsistent with the evidence. The evidence from the Delta, from the order of battle dispute, from the documented corruption of the body count system, from the assessments of the civilian population's political loyalties, from the operational history of every pacification program that was tried and found insufficient. All of this pointed toward a war that was failing in the field, not just in the political arena, and that was failing because of strategic and institutional errors that no adjustment of political will could have corrected. The counter-argument, that the war was not winnable as fought, that the strategy of attrition in an environment where the enemy controlled the tempo and could choose when to fight and when to disappear was fundamentally flawed, was supported by the evidence and was made by serious analysts during the war itself, not only in retrospect. It was made quietly, in classified reports and private memoranda, by people who understood the operational realities of the Delta and the rest of Vietnam, and who drew the logical conclusions from those realities. Those conclusions were not incorporated into the decision-making that continued to govern the war's conduct. They were filed, noted, and set aside in favor of the narrative of progress that the system required. The men who made the last radio calls from the Mekong Delta were not dramatic figures. They were soldiers and sailors doing what soldiers and sailors do, calling in their positions, reporting contacts, requesting support, transmitting information through channels that processed it into numbers that bore an increasingly uncertain relationship to what had actually happened. Some of those transmissions have been preserved in military archives. Some of them have been described in memoirs and oral histories. Most of them have been lost, absorbed into the administrative record of a war that produced more documentation than any previous American military conflict, and that understood less, in proportion to the documentation, about what it was doing. The last American combat death in the Mekong Delta came in 1971, though the last American deaths in Vietnam came later in 1975, when 2 Marines were killed during the evacuation of Saigon. The last American combat operation in the Delta was conducted by units whose predecessors had conducted similar operations in the same waterways for years before them, and was reported through the same channels in the same language, and produced statistics that were compiled into assessments that described a situation that bore its own characteristic relationship to the reality of what was happening in the rice paddies and canals and swamps of the southernmost provinces of Vietnam. The Delta itself continued. The river continued to flow. The monsoons continued to come and go. The rice continued to be planted and harvested by the farmers who had been planting and harvesting it through the period of American military involvement, and who continued planting and harvesting it after the American military involvement ended. The villages that had been destroyed were rebuilt, slowly, with the materials available. The contaminated land was farmed anyway, because the alternative to farming contaminated land was not farming. The unexploded ordnance remained in the soil and the waterways, killing and maiming people who encountered it in the course of ordinary agricultural activity at a rate that continued for decades. The reunification of Vietnam in 1976, the formal administrative merger of North and South Vietnam into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, resolved the political question that the war had been fought over, though it resolved it in the way that the war's critics had predicted it would resolve, through the military victory of the North and the NLF, rather than through the consolidated independence of South Vietnam that American policy had aimed to produce. The resolution of the political question did not resolve the human consequences of the war. Those consequences continued to be experienced by Vietnamese civilians, by American veterans, by the families of people who had died, by the communities that had been transformed or destroyed by a decade of fighting. The official reckoning with what the war had been and what it had done continued for decades, incompletely and selectively. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, dedicated in 1982, provided a form of national acknowledgement that had been lacking in the immediate aftermath of the war. The names on the wall numbered more than 58,000, each representing a specific death, a specific person, a specific loss that was now public and permanent. The wall was notable, among other things, for what it did not include. It did not include the names of the Vietnamese who had died. It did not include the names of the soldiers who had died from service-connected illness after returning home. It did not include any accounting of the strategic decisions that had produced the deaths whose names it bore. It was a memorial to the fallen, not to the war, and the distinction was deliberate and reflected the specific political calculus of a nation that needed to acknowledge loss without reopening the questions of cause and responsibility that the loss raised. The question of responsibility was the question that the institutional record was least equipped to answer. The system that had produced the inflated body counts, the corrupted pacification statistics, the false intelligence assessments, had done so through a distributed process that implicated thousands of individuals at every level of the command structure without assigning clear responsibility to any of them. The general who approved the low order of battle estimate had been acting within a system that had given him every incentive to approve it. The officer who filed an inflated after-action report had been responding to a system that had given him every reason to inflate it. The soldier who counted a civilian death as an enemy kill had been operating in an environment where the institutional pressures pointed clearly in that direction. The responsibility was distributed through the system in a way that made individual accountability both theoretically justifiable and practically elusive. This was not an accident. It was one of the ways that institutions protect themselves from the consequences of their own failures. The system that produced the misrepresentation of the war was the same system that was responsible for investigating the misrepresentation and assigning accountability for it. The investigating system had the same institutional interests as the system being investigated. The result was a series of investigations, internal reviews, and reforms that acknowledged the existence of specific problems while declining to pursue the broader question of systemic responsibility to conclusions that would have required the most senior officials to be held accountable for decisions that had been made at their level. The operational record of the Delta in the final years of American involvement, from 1970 through 1973, showed the specific pattern of a war being handed off rather than won. American forces reduced in number. ARVN forces took over operational responsibilities in more provinces. The statistical indicators of pacification showed improvement because the metric system that generated them continued to generate improvement regardless of underlying reality, because the institutional pressure that had shaped the metrics from the beginning had not been reformed and continued to shape them. The briefings in Saigon showed progress. The classified assessments, shared privately among those with access to them, showed something more complicated. The radio operators who transmitted the final American operational reports from the Delta in 1972 and 1973 were doing their jobs with the same professionalism that radio operators in combat zones always do their jobs. They transmitted the information they were given. The information was processed through channels. The channels produced assessments. The assessments went to commanders who used them to make decisions. The decisions were made in a context that had been shaped by a decade of institutional choices, each one individually defensible, collectively responsible for a catastrophic strategic failure that cost more than 58,000 American lives and somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, depending on which estimates and which categories of death one accepts. The last radio call from the Mekong Delta was not a dramatic transmission. It was routine, procedural, part of the administrative record of a military operation in the final phase of an American military involvement that ended not with victory or defeat in any conventional sense, but with a withdrawal that left the underlying situation, the political competition for control of Vietnam, unresolved and continuing. The war had been called a war, had been managed as a war, had consumed the resources and lives of a war, and had produced in the end, not a war's conclusion, but a war's continuation under different management. The fiscal year 1973 saw the last American combat operations in Vietnam. The fiscal year 1974 saw the continuation of American military assistance to South Vietnam at reduced levels. The fiscal year 1975 saw the reduction of that assistance further as the American Congress, responding to political realities that had been in development for years, cut the funding that was keeping the South Vietnamese military operational. The South Vietnamese military, denied the fuel and ammunition and replacement parts that American funding had been providing, found itself unable to sustain the operational tempo that the military situation required. By the spring of 1975, The military situation in the Delta and throughout South Vietnam had deteriorated past the point at which any conceivable American military intervention could have stabilized it. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the institution that American military assistance had spent more than a decade trying to build into a capable fighting force, collapsed in the face of a coordinated North Vietnamese offensive with a speed that surprised even those observers who had been most pessimistic about its prospects. The speed of the collapse was not simply a military failure. It was a reflection of the accumulated consequences of a decade of institutional dysfunction, of an army that had been built around metrics rather than capability, around American support rather than indigenous motivation, around statistics that showed progress rather than progress itself. The last South Vietnamese military units in the Delta stopped fighting not because they were defeated in a series of decisive engagements, but because the institutional structure that had sustained them, the command relationships and the logistics networks and the political authority that gave orders meaning, dissolved in the course of days. Soldiers who had fought in many cases with genuine courage and genuine commitment through years of a brutal and confusing war found themselves without orders, without supplies, without the institutional context that defined what fighting meant and for whom. They went home. They returned to the villages and the cities they had come from and tried to become, in a new political reality, people rather than soldiers. The Delta absorbed the end of the war the way it had absorbed everything else, with the patient, seasonal indifference of a landscape that had been contested and fought over and saturated with violence and loss for a very long time. The river kept moving. The tide kept shifting the balance of salt and fresh water in the lower reaches of the waterways. The birds returned to areas that had been too dangerous to inhabit. The fish returned to waterways that had been too contaminated to support them, or they did not return, depending on the specific chemistry of a specific waterway and what had been done to it and what had not been done to clean it up. The American involvement in the Mekong Delta lasted approximately a decade, from the early deployments of American advisors in the early 1960s through the final withdrawal of combat forces and then the final withdrawal of advisory personnel in 1973. In that time, the Delta was the site of thousands of individual military operations, of pacification programs that were tried and modified and expanded and declared successful and eventually abandoned, of a Phoenix program that neutralized tens of thousands of individuals through methods that were never subject to effective oversight, of civilian casualties that were not counted and not acknowledged in any systematic way, of environmental damage that was not understood at the time and would not be fully documented for decades. The radio traffic that documented all of this, the operational messages and the intelligence reports and the after-action summaries, fills thousands of feet of archival space in military records repositories. Most of it has been declassified. Much of it has been read by historians and journalists and veterans looking for the specific transmission that explained what had happened to their unit on a specific day. Some of it still waits to be read, to be processed into the kind of analytical synthesis that would produce a clearer picture of what the war in the Delta actually was, as opposed to what the metrics and the briefings said it was. The picture that emerges from the combination of the official record and the oral histories and the investigative journalism and the retrospective analyses is not a picture of heroic tragedy or of inevitable failure. It is a picture of an institution operating in its own interest in a context that rewarded the production of false information and punished the production of accurate information, of an individual experience shaped by that institutional context in ways that were not understood at the time and are not fully processed even now, of a landscape and a population that paid costs that were never fully acknowledged in the political accounting of the war's consequences. The Delta's waterways on a morning in 1968, with the war at its most intense, held all of this simultaneously. They held the soldier in the boat who was tired and scared and 20 years old. They held the intelligence officer in Saigon who knew that the numbers he was compiling did not accurately represent the situation, but compiled them anyway. They held the general who looked at the body count statistics and saw in them the confirmation of a strategy that he needed to believe was working. They held the Vietnamese farmer who watched the boats move past his field and waited for the day when the war would be over, not knowing that the day was still years away and that the war's ending would not be the ending he was waiting for. They held the radio call going out over the frequencies, reporting the day's operations, the contact made and the contact broken, the casualties sustained and the enemy casualties estimated, the grid coordinates of the current position and the grid coordinates of the next objective, moving through the channels toward the command post where it would be received and processed and filed, becoming another small piece of the official record of a war that continued on schedule and according to procedure, long after anyone could explain what it was supposed to accomplish.